Well, welcome one and all. I'm Tom Bedell. We had hoped to be celebrating our 20th year of the Brattleboro Literary Festival live and rather than over Zoom, but we're nonetheless happy to have gathered as many great writers together as we have, and we have a lively session ahead of us this evening. One we're calling Legends of the West and some strange doings out there among the tumbleweeds. In the classic Western film, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, a newspaper man, Maxwell Scott, says he's not going to run the true story of who shot Liberty Valance. No, sir, he says. This is the West, sir. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend. And considering that many are nervous about the current state of truth in today's social intercourse, that at sometimes seems more prone to impeachment than the lies and tactics of fear mounted against it, we have with us the co-authors of two books that couldn't be more timely in confronting that very subject, Jude Joffe-Block and Bryan Burrough. Jude's Driving While Brown, Sheriff Joe Arpaio versus the Latino Resistance, is written with journalist Terry Green Sterling. It details the, I think it's fair to say, relentless anti-immigrant career of Joe Arpaio, perhaps best known as Sheriff Joe Arpaio, a post he held in Maricopa County, Arizona for 23 years, from 1993 to 2017. It may be enough to say about Arpaio that he received the 45th president's first pardon. Jude is a journalist in Phoenix who has reported on immigration for over a decade for the likes of NPR, The Guardian, The World, and most recently for the Associated Press. Bryan's the author of a half dozen other books, including the best-selling Barbarians at the Gate, The Big Rich, Public Enemies, and Days of Rage. He's written for Vanity Fair since 1992, consults now and again for 60 Minutes, and calls himself a proud Texan. His book, co-written with two other proud Texans, Chris Tomlinson and Jason Stanford, is Forget the Alamo, The Rise and Fall of an American Myth, an entertaining attempt to try and set the record straight about the wholesale fabrications, the rewriting of history to a fantastical degree about what really happened at the Alamo in 1836. So we're going to leave time for both authors to answer some questions. We hope you in the audience will ask some of them. You should see a Q&A toggle on your screen where we urge you to write some questions that I'll happily pose to the authors. And you can also upvote others' questions that you see with the thumbs up icon in case we only have time for a few. So Jude and Bryan, I believe you're leading off. Please tell us about your projects and one hopes assure us that facts still matter.
Tom, thank you so much. And on behalf of Jude and Tom, welcome y'all. Thanks for showing up. I'm joining you from Austin, Texas, which is a long way from Brattleboro, but I've been in and skied in Vermont many times, so I know how very beautiful it can be this time of year. My book is called Forget the Alamo, which if you have ever been here, spent time here, or God forbid, been born and raised here as I was, you know the very title is a provocation. It's kind of a slap in the face to Texans, because when we talk about the Alamo, we are not talking about a battle. We are not talking about a siege. We are talking about the defining event of what we call the Texas creation myth, the defining event of an awful lot of Texans' cultural identity. And if that sounds weird, because people in North Dakota and maybe Vermont don't really internalize the state's history as part of their own identity, that is the case with a lot of people in Texas. It was frankly the case with me until I started researching this book 2 or 3 years ago. I pretty much drank the Yahoo Texas Kool-Aid. I wore come and take it socks, for those of you who know, understand the significance of that. The book began at a breakfast. Three of us, Jason, Chris, and I. Chris is a columnist for the Houston and San Antonio papers. Jason is a longtime political consultant, a writer, and now head of communications for the Austin schools. And Chris started talking about his latest column for the Houston Chronicle, in which he was going to argue the need to rebrand Texas, to to grow the old cowboy myth to include more people now that Anglos are barely 40% of Texas. It seemed silly that we were still so much of Texas identity in culture and commerce was predicated on these old stories. And as Chris was prepared to argue, old myths. And so, I was sitting there eating my migas and Jason is, having his huevos. And we're half listening because we always hear about Chris's latest column. And at some point, Chris says, everything you think you know about the Alamo is a lie. And I kind of looked up and said, okay, such as, and he said a few things. He'd clearly done his homework, but what really got me, and here there's a little bit of an overlap, substantial overlap with Jude's excellent book, was when he said, what you don't understand, aging Anglo writer, and aging white writer, is the extent to which the Texas creation myth, the Alamo story, has been used to oppress Tejanos, Mexican Americans in Texas for 180 years. And that really got my attention because that was utterly foreign to me. To me, the Alamo myth, the myth of the white settlers who came and fought for their freedom against dastardly Santa Anna and his Mexican army, was defining. It was what made Texas, Texas. We were the only state to join the Union as an independent nation, the only state to defeat a foreign power in a war. And so I said, and if you'll pardon my French, but in an effort, Tom, to remain accurate, I slapped my hand on the table and said, "That's a fucking book." And by the end of two more hours of conversation, I said, "And you can only call it one thing, and that's Forget the Alamo." When I started dating my current girlfriend about a month later, she's a 7th generation Texan. People down here introduce themselves by 5th, 6th, or 7th generation. Less than that's really not worth mentioning. And I told her the name of the book, and she literally on our second date slithered out of the booth onto the floor saying, "You just can't say that. You just can't say Forget the Alamo here." So what we did in the book, it was essentially 3 of us, we split up the work, and we essentially, the easiest way to discuss it is to divide the myths into 2. Those associated with the battle and siege itself in March 1836, and those associated with the larger idea of why these people were fighting. And that is the associated myths of the entire Texas Revolution. I had thought that what we were going to dig into with the battle and the siege would be more controversial than the larger issues. But when we got into it, wow, I had not realized how personal people take this. As some of you may know, we famously in Texas at least, our biggest publicity event was in July at the State History Museum. The 3 of us were going to go, and we had 300, 400, 500 people who were going to come on Zoom, and we were all excited. And 3 hours beforehand, we found that we had been canceled by the Lieutenant Governor of Texas, who basically said that we were awful people who'd written a fact-free attack on Texas history and didn't deserve showing up in at a Texas state facility. I think what got him most excited, most incensed, was what got people most incensed. It was not just the idea that the battle and the siege itself, frankly, the myths are not supported by the historical record. No, there was no famous line in the sand. No, they didn't show up at the Alamo to fight against freedom and oppression. In fact, there was no decision to fight the Mexicans. They just got trapped. They didn't say that they were going to fight to the last man, but in fact, we now know from the historical record, from the Mexican accounts, that they offered to surrender twice. In fact, Santa Anna, the Mexican general, the Mexican president, rejected those surrender offers because he wanted to, in essence, kill every one of them as an example against other revolutionaries, others who might try to take Mexican sovereign land. But the thing that I think has gotten people most upset about our book was the idea that, in fact, these 180 odd men were not there to fight for their freedom against Mexican oppression. In fact, any brief delve into the historical record shows that it does not support the idea that Texans didn't have their freedom or were in any way oppressed. In fact, they had more rights than other Mexican citizens because after 15 years of arguing about it, the Mexican government allowed them, unlike everybody else, to hold slaves. And in fact, that's what we argue the underlying cause of the Texas Revolution was. And that's what really got people so upset down here, I think. And that is because Americans came to Mexican land in 1821 to do one thing and one thing only, and that was make money by planting cotton, as they were doing across the South at the time. And Southerners from Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, they only knew one way how to plant cotton in those days, and that was with black hands, and to harvest it with black hands. They needed their slaves. Slaves were by far the most valuable asset they brought to Texas and that they kept in Texas since the land was largely free. And you see, and we go through the record in the book of showing how Stephen F. Austin, the father of Texas, the famous father of Texas, spent the lion's share of his time arguing with the Mexican government about the absolute necessity of keeping slaves. And, every 2 or 3 years, as would happen in the 1820s and 30s, the Mexican government, there would be a new emperor, a new prime minister, a new minister who would say, no more slaves. And Austin would say, okay, that's it, we're leaving, everybody's leaving. And some people did. And then ultimately, after 15 years of this, a lot of Texans began putting away their suitcases and taking out their guns. And as you tell that story, it is a very different story from that taught to every 7th grader in Texas for 150 years. It is not a story of heroic Anglo Americans fighting against dastardly brown Mexicans. It is a story of, a Mexican government who was trying to retain its own land in the face of an illegal revolution that was largely, furthered by those who wanted to retain slavery. Ultimately, when the Texans won, of course, as some of you may know, they became an independent nation. And any examination of its constitution, the Texas Constitution, will show that it was pretty much the most militant slave state in modern history in the Western Hemisphere. There's never been anything quite like it. So that gives you some sense of what Forget the Alamo, the book, was about. I'm fascinated to hear about Jude's book. We have a lot of overlap in our book shows, by speaking with a lot of Tejanos as well as Tejano academics, the incredible toll this has taken on Tejanos in Texas. That in fact, being told forget the Alamo, or remember the Alamo, to a Tejano in Texas is it's a sly insult that has been done for generations. We spoke to any number of Tejanos, especially those of a certain age, who will tell you that they grew up feeling that they were American as Statue of Liberty, until they went into that 7th grade history class and were told, you and people like you killed Davy Crockett, and that's where an awful lot of Tejanos began realizing they grew up believing they were Americans, but for a lot of people in Texas, they were never going to be anything but Mexicans, no matter how long they live here. And that's Forget the Alamo. Let me hand over to Jude, please.
Thank you, Bryan. And yeah, that is so fascinating. And you're right, a tremendous amount of overlap, really, with these themes of what happened in the land that became the United States after the Mexican-American War, and how did the Anglo and Mexican and Mexican-American populations interact in those lands, and what stories did they tell themselves about who belonged there. And so I'm going to share my screen and do a presentation here. Let's see. All right. Hopefully that's showing up for everybody. And first I want to just introduce my co-author. Hopefully she's not behind the window here. It's on my screen, but that's Terry Green Sterling. She wishes she could be on screen today. She's in the audience with us. She's recovering from a medical procedure. That's her interviewing Joe Arpaio in 2009. And we both had spent years independently, Terry more than me, since she's a lifelong Arizonan from a borderlands family, really grew up immersed in this story. I came to Arizona in 2012, and we had both been reporting on Arpaio and the resistance against him for years independently, and then teamed up to write this book. Let's see. Okay, and so really, in a nutshell, what the book is about is a powerful Arizona sheriff who trailblazes a crackdown on illegal immigration that had really never been seen before, and became an icon of a burgeoning movement to criminalize unauthorized immigrants, and the Latino resistance that organized to stop him, that helped sue him for racial profiling and won that lawsuit, and then organized to oust him from office and ultimately succeeded in 2016. And in many ways, it's a story about shifting the narratives around some of these myths. And, you know, just to bring us back to where we left off with the history Bryan was talking about, you know, a few miles away in Texas, in Arizona, once Arizona became part of the United States, people of Mexican descent were still referred to as Mexicans, even if they were born in this country. And this is a picture that shows the YMCA branch in a mining town called Miami. This was the Mexican branch of the YMCA. It was a segregated YMCA. It would stay that way for decades. The pool, the Mexican families would only be allowed to swim in the pool even into the 1940s on certain days of the week, right before the pool was drained. And so I'm showing this slide also because the young man who's to the left of the sign standing up, that's Samuel Gutierrez, and he, as a teenager, a few years after this photo was taken, was deported in mass deportations in the 1930s that didn't really bother to distinguish between who was actually a Mexican national without legal status in the United States and who was an American-born citizen. And as it would turn out, his son Alfredo Gutierrez would go on to be one of the activists in Arizona who would organize against Joe Arpaio in a completely different yet related historical context decades later. And so that brings us to Joe Arpaio, who interestingly was born in Springfield, Massachusetts before he became an Arizona icon. And he was born the son of an unwanted Italian immigrant father. For those of you who were in Jialin Yang's fantastic talk this morning, his father Ciro came from Italy in the early 1920s and just barely made it in given the harsh quotas to keep out large numbers of Italian immigrants. And Arpaio had to deal with being called anti-immigrant, anti-Italian slurs as a child. In Springfield, Massachusetts, growing up, he loved to go to the movie theater and watch Westerns. And of course, saw the white-hatted sheriff rounding up the bad guys with his posse. And later this would become an inspiration. He had spent many years in the agency that became the Drug Enforcement Administration and worked undercover and was brilliant at creating new identities for himself in that job. And basically the last identity he created for himself was America's toughest sheriff, as sort of an encore career for himself after he retired from the DEA. He became Maricopa County Sheriff in 1993. And part of the mythology or part of his brand was being very tough. And that meant, you know, finding bad guys to demonize. Early on, it was the inmates and made them wear cartoonish black and white uniforms like you see in this picture, pink underwear, made them sleep in outdoor tents. And in the early 2000s, there was a loud faction of his base of Republican voters in Arizona who started to become very focused and worried about illegal immigration along the Arizona border. And Arpaio, who this had not been a priority for him before, but he did pivot to train his focus on that and joined other state efforts to criminalize, arrest, and help deport unauthorized immigrants from Arizona. And this is a video of a press conference he was involved in 2007. Up until that point, it had really been the federal government's domain to arrest unauthorized immigrants who were not being charged with any crimes, who were just in violation of civil immigration laws. And Arpaio was interested in changing that. At the same time, the federal government had offered a partnership with his agency called 287G that would deputize his deputies to be allowed to make immigration arrests as well. And this is him announcing his goals.
My program, my philosophy is a pure program. You go after illegals. I'm not afraid to say that. Then you go after them and you lock them up.
Okay, and one of his tactics were worksite raids, rounding up immigrant workers who did not have authorization to be in the United States, charging them with felonies. Once they were in his jail, this was a press conference he called in 2009, where he marched all the undocumented immigrants his deputies had arrested and marched them to a segregated portion of the jail and invited TV cameras to film. And he also was invented these large-scale neighborhood sweeps where his deputies would patrol. They would really swarm certain neighborhoods. Often these were heavily Latino neighborhoods, and they would swarm these neighborhoods and pull over cars that had violated any kind of traffic violation. So a broken taillight, cracked windshield, any reason to pull a car over. And if anyone in the car, passenger or driver, was suspected of being an undocumented immigrant, they would be questioned and turned over to ICE. At the end of these operations, the sheriff's office would publicize how many undocumented immigrants had been arrested. And this is Lydia Guzman, an activist who became very involved in trying to help immigrants and Latino US citizens who felt like these tactics were also profiling them, that they were being questioned, held longer, treated with suspicion because of their appearance. And she started to collect evidence at these sweeps. And I'm going to read you a portion, just a very brief one. So Guzman urged Somos America activists, that's the name of her group, in an email to help document Arpaio's racial profiling. We have all you need, cameras, log sheets, water, but we need bodies. This is a great way for you to invite a friend and be a part of protecting justice and civil rights. Filming deputies required courage. Volunteers had to assert their First Amendment rights while risking arrest. Dennis Gilman, a white self-described hellraiser who'd recently come to activism by leaving water on desert trails for thirsty migrants, followed deputies tenaciously with a new video camera. He created an archive on YouTube. Meanwhile, attorney Danny Ortega and activist Alfredo Gutierrez took turns yelling into a bullhorn, hoping their shouts were within earshot of the handcuffed men and women marching into Arpaio's command center. At these sweeps, Arpaio would set up a command center where everyone was arrested. No digan nada, don't say anything. Pidan hablar con un abogado, ask to speak to a lawyer. If just one person could be spared deportation, Ortega thought, it would be worth it. He told us he'd never imagined his legal training would take him outside a raid trailer, yelling at people to try to help them protect their rights. And then I'll leave it at that. But basically, the scene explains how Lydia and these other activists would show up, and they're trying to help save people from deportation, but also document abuses that they could later use in court against Arpaio. And this movement against Arpaio involves day laborers who had recently arrived. It involves people like Alfredo Gutierrez, who you heard about earlier, whose family went back generations in Arizona. It involved dreamers and their allies. And this racial profiling lawsuit that they helped collect evidence for went to court in Phoenix and federal court in 2012. And Arpaio denied any wrongdoing. But the federal judge in the case, Judge Murray Snow, found that in fact, Arpaio's deputies had violated 4th and 14th Amendment rights of Latino drivers and passengers with the immigration tactics he was using. He ordered sweeping changes at the agency. He also, at that point, Arpaio had lost his 287G partnership that you heard him speaking about earlier in that video. The Obama administration had revoked it at this point. And the judge said at this point, Arpaio did not have legal authority to arrest immigrants who had not committed crimes. And he forbade Arpaio from doing so. But it would later turn out that Arpaio had not implemented that order and had continued to have deputies arrest immigrants just for being in the country unlawfully who had not committed other crimes. Because of that violation, the judge considered in 2016 referring Arpaio for criminal contempt of court. And these are activists outside the federal courthouse in Phoenix, and they had created a balloon, this inflatable of Arpaio's likeness wearing prison stripes. And for years at this point, part of their messaging was the message that the real criminal was Arpaio, not immigrants that he was trying to criminalize. And so this idea, arrest Arpaio, not the people, he's the criminal, the immigrants who are hardworking and who are here, they are not criminals, even though that was very much an idea that was embedded deeply in political culture in Arizona at the time, this conflation of people who did not have legal status being criminals. And in 2016, activists formed a Basta Arpaio coalition, that's what they called it, to oust Arpaio from office and to galvanize voters of color who did not have a history of voting to vote against him. And meanwhile, on the national stage, Arpaio was one of the first people to endorse Trump and spoke at the Republican National Convention, stumped for him in various places. And then on election night, of course, and along the way, I should add, Arpaio, his supporters, his opponents, everyone sees a parallel between Arpaio and Trump. They have a lot in common, fixating on illegal immigration, but also they had both been involved in spreading the false conspiracy theory that Obama's birth certificate was not real, among other things. And so then in November 2016, Arpaio lost pretty devastatingly by 13 points, but Trump won. And that criminal case that we talked about does go forward. And Arpaio is found guilty of criminal contempt of court, which is seen by the Latino community that had organized against him so long as the victory they were hoping for. But within weeks, Trump extends his first presidential pardon to Arpaio, sparing him from any kind of penalty. And then I'll just close with this slide, which shows Maria Castro, who's a young activist who had first started campaigning to mobilize voters as a teenager in 2011 to oust Arizona politicians who were trying to criminalize immigrants and pass laws. And in 2016, she was part of Basta Arpaio. And in 2020, she went door to door to try to mobilize voters against Trump. And this is what she had to say, was basically that the energy she saw on the ground in some of the same neighborhoods she'd been monitoring for years, the enthusiasm level was just much higher in 2020. People thought that their vote actually mattered and were more mobilized to vote. And she thinks it's because they saw the difference that was made in 2016. And her line was, I think the defeat of Joe Arpaio made it tangible that we can defeat the villains that haunt our dreams. And so I will just stop it there. Okay.
Okay. Let me get back on here. Jude, I appreciate that you dedicated your book to the truth seekers. And you both use some terms in your books that define them in a way, and perhaps you could talk about them and define them for us. Jude, in your case, it's restrictionism, and for Bryan, historiography.
Well, for us, historiography just meant we were writing the history of a history. We wanted to show how certain factual events became twisted into a legend. And then, the various groups that were served, we call the Alamo story the Texas creation myth. We call it, the Anglo-centric narrative of Texas history, because it was written entirely by white people during the 1800s, and then reinforced by the Texas legislature repeatedly during the 1900s. As early as 1898, you had the Texas legislature actually, announcing investigations of the new history department at the University of Texas because they weren't sufficiently supportive of the Southern lost cause myth. And of course, that got intertwined with Texas history such that, in 2010 and then most famously in 2018, it's now the actual law of Texas that all school children must be taught that all defenders of the Alamo were heroes. So we wanted to tell the development of that story, which of course peaks in the 50s and early 1960s. For about 100 years or so, this whole Alamo thing was pretty much a Texas thing. And then with Disney's Davy Crockett, Fess Parker in 1950, and most famously with John Wayne's movie, The Alamo in 1960, and LBJ in the White House in the 60s, these are kind of the three big building blocks that make the Alamo kind of an international icon, an icon, that means different things to different people. And the most fascinating part of it to me was something that we waded in and were really the first to ever get into, and that is how everything that people now want to call revisionism, essentially, but which is actually, I think, an effort to reclaim the Alamo of actual history, of the historical record. All the first places that began being questioned were by the first Mexican American academics who got their PhDs in those first Chicano studies programs in the 60s, and especially in the 1970s. And they began coming out and say, wait, this story of Texas, this story of the Alamo is not what I was taught in my household. And if you try, it's just a fascinating journey from those first questionings in the 60s and 70s up through a massive blossoming of kind of questioning the Alamo story in the 90s, and then how that has built over the last 30 years. Altogether, I'd say that's what our historiography looks like.
I have to confess, when I first got your book, I went right to the index and looked up Fess Parker, because I'm old enough to be the coonskin cap generation. And my brother and I, forced by our mother into taking tap dance lessons as youngsters, can still do a shuffle to the Disney song, Davy Crockett, King of the Wild Frontier. It's liquored up a bit, at any rate.
We think that, while it may undercut our message somewhat, we think that the centrality of the Alamo legend to people's identity is strongest among people of not only your generation, Tom, but mine. I just turned 60. That for our kids, they look on the idea of the importance of the Alamo to Texas identity. The whole thing is like nuts. They just don't get it. So a lot of people argue that demographics will take care of this as Texas becomes steadily more liberal. I think the fact that just younger people just don't care as much about this is going to cause this new reexamination of the legends of Texas. I think in time will kind of take care of itself, but it will take time.
Jude, I guess restrictionism is a little more self-explanatory, but.
Well, yeah, I mean, but it is an interesting point, because we were trying to we were chronicling these dueling movements, and we have people that we follow in quite in detail and see things through their eyes in the book. And we have representatives of this movement for Latino civil rights, for immigrant rights. But what do you call the other side? There wasn't a word that they self-identified with. I would, when I asked them this, I would often hear, well, we're the rule of law side. But you know, we needed something a little more specific and more so we used restrictionists, which you know, some people identify with, and others, as we mentioned in the book, as a caveat, you know, not everyone that we identified as part of the restrictionist movement would choose to self-identify that way. But basically the movement to restrict immigration.
Right. So we have a couple of questions from the audience. One from Jim Gardner. How far-reaching is Arpaio's pardon, and are there any outstanding charges against him?
At this point, I mean, the pardon, I mean, it was actually really interesting, because one thing that went all the way to the Ninth Circuit, because he was actually arguing that because he got pardoned, the guilty verdict should be wiped away. And it was this sort of interesting legal question that went up to the Ninth Circuit, but ultimately the decision was, no, you were still found guilty, but you were pardoned of any kind of sentence. And he was facing, the maximum was 6 months in jail, which was really a long shot. It was more likely that it would be some kind of fine or something like that. But I think, you know, to this idea of legacy and legends, he was very interested in having a clean slate and having that pardon completely be invalidate anything that had happened in the courtroom. But that did not happen. He wasn't facing anything else. His situation is that since he was ousted from sheriff in 2016, he's run for office numerous times after that. He tried to run for an open Senate seat in the primary and came in last. He tried to run for his sheriff's office, again, lost in the primary. And then most recently, he's now 89 years old. He's announced that he wants to run to be the mayor of his hometown, which is called Fountain Hills. It's a suburb in the far reaches of Maricopa County. So that's what's going on with him. He loves the spotlight and isn't really ready to give up public life.
All right. But Brian, Jim also asks, is there a parallel movement in Texas that aligns with the Arizona movement that brought Arpaio down?
Very funny that you should ask that, because it's kind of a sensitive question. It's one that we really haven't delved into. But there is no, I was watching Jude's slideshow with all these brown activists, wondering where these people are in Texas. Because look, I spent the last 30 years in New York, where people of color are not shy about demanding the rights that other people may be taking from them. While there may be individuals that do that in Texas, the groups by and large are not as aggressive. And I found myself wondering why. LULAC, which is kind of the Mexican American or the Hispanic NAACP, was, you know, founded back in the day, I think it was in the 20s, as kind of a, you know, they wanted to, I'm forgetting the word, they wanted to blend in. They weren't trying to rock the boat. They were accommodationist. And, you know, I think, and I may be way out over my skis, but we just haven't seen in Texas the type of boat rocking that I took for granted in the North. No, we by and large don't see that type of stuff that we were seeing in Jude's wonderful slideshow. What we have gotten, and we kind of knew the book was becoming a thing one day, when, as you know, they're now debating what to do about the Alamo site. They want to put in a world-class museum, because the Alamo itself has always been deeply disappointed, kind of this dingy, shadowy building and an amateurish little museum. And now you've got militia groups that are showing up to protest that type of thing. And by and large, they've dominated the public discussion over what to do with the site. until our book came out, and suddenly you had members of LULAC showing up with our book, facing off against these militia groups in Alamo Plaza with AR-15s versus our little book. And that's when, look, we're authors. We'd like to believe that we've shifted the conversation a little bit, and we would like to believe that.
Well, I did want to ask that. I mean, aside from book sales and reviews, about the reactions to your books. Bryan, you already spoke about the dust up you had with Republican Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick. Anything else? And Jude, any kind of reaction like that?
Well, I would just say to all authors that may be on this, if you can get a politician to cancel you, it is by and large a wonderful thing. You become kind of an icon of free speech, even though up until the moment it happened, you'd given very little thought to this type of thing happening in America. I mean, Texas politics was just an iceberg that we happened to run into. And 9 days later, we woke up, what I thought was going to be this little regional book that we three buddies did in our spare time was at number 10 on the New York Times bestseller list. So if you can get canceled, it's a good thing.
And in our case, we haven't run into anything nearly as dramatic. I mean, I do think it's also a product, though, of how fast things have shifted here. You know, I do think that there was a time when Arpaio was incredibly powerful, and journalists who were writing anything critical did sometimes encounter issues. I mean, famously, Phoenix New Times, the alt weekly where co-author Terry Green Sterling worked for many years. The publisher and the editor were actually arrested by Arpaio's deputies at one point and jailed as part of a skirmish. And they had to, the sheriff's office the county had to pay a big settlement for that wrongful arrest. But I mean, so Arizona has shifted in a way where I think our book came out at a time where it wasn't as shaking things up quite in the same way Bryan was to tell people things that our story had been sort of unraveling before people's eyes for quite some time by the time our book came out, and we just pulled it all together. And I did want to piggyback on the last question, which is that about the role of activists in Texas. One thing that happened in Arizona, because the activists were trained here and were organizing really since 2004, which is when the big assault on immigrants and by extension, to a certain degree, the Latino community began. Activists in Arizona had a lot of practical know-how before other places, especially during the Trump administration, places that hadn't been as used to immigrant rights organizing. And so you saw some of the Arizona activists going to other states. Texas was one of them, to help teach lessons learned. And then what we're just seeing right now under Governor Abbott in Texas is really interesting, because some of his proposals to be tough on the border and to use state and local law enforcement in ways to crack down on migrants because the federal government isn't doing the job he wishes, it is very reminiscent of what's happened in Arizona in the past. This experimentation with using local law enforcement to do what is usually considered under the federal purview. And so we've seen Abbott getting very creative with some of these ideas about using state troopers to things about trespassing, and I'm a little out of my league here, but things about criminalizing migrants and having state authority to arrest them. And so Arpaio is really the best parallel for what that experimentation played out looks like.
Question for you, if I may. Being in New York for the last 30 years, I can't say that immigration, much less safety issues along the border, ranked in my top 15 issues that I worried about on a Sunday morning. I can imagine for many of our, viewers, listeners in Vermont, it probably isn't that big a deal now. When you look at what Arpaio did, and to an extent what Abbott's doing now, did you see any veracity, any credibility to the concerns and perhaps crimes that he was concerned about? Or did you think that the Arpaioization of the border is purely about riling up the racist impulses among those inclined to be right-wingers?
I mean, I think what has been well documented here, I mean, so to speak to our theme about legends, I mean, one of the key things here is that in Arizona, these state laws were passed that basically turned undocumented people into felons. So, for example, in other states, they didn't have such laws, but in Arizona, it became a state crime to work without the proper documentation, that this was become a state felony that you could be prosecuted for identity theft. Even if you worked with your own name and a made up social security number, for example, that could still be considered a felony. And so suddenly somebody who's working is now a felon. And in another example, there was a state law that was passed that criminalized driving people into the state, smuggling people into the state from the border, made it a state felony to smuggle someone into Arizona for money. Well, that got interpreted by Arpaio and the county prosecutor, the county attorney at the time, to mean that they could also extend that to the people in the car, the migrants, and prosecute them for smuggling themselves as a conspiracy. And so now they became felons too. So now a migrant who got in a car in Arizona and paid someone for that ride is now considered a felon. And so suddenly then Arpaio can publicize these numbers to the public and say, I have this many undocumented felons in my jails. Undocumented felons are filling up my jail.
Yeah.
And that's because, and so this idea that this conflation of immigration status and criminality was really by design, and then that riles people up further.
That's what so stunned me, was when Trump gets up there and early on in that administration and begins talking about murderers and rapists. I reported about these issues for the Wall Street Journal back in the day in the 1980s. I don't even remember criminal behavior being part of the discussion. Do you find it? I mean, forget about defining someone's immigration status as being felonious. Do you find that these people by and large are murderers, or that there's a significant percentage of them that could be classified as criminals?
Research on the topic has shown that immigrants are less likely than US born people to commit crimes. And so, I mean, yes, there are people who are immigrants who commit crimes, of course, it does happen, but as a population, it is at a lower rate than native born US citizens.
Could you both speak briefly to the changing demographics of the areas and how that might change things in the elections ahead?
Well, the funny thing is here, and this is, I don't need to open up this can of worms, but it's counterintuitive argument that an awful lot of Tejanos in the Rio Grande Valley went to Trump in this last election. And a lot of it, Texas Monthly just has a fascinating cover story on it last month, that a lot, Democrats want to treat Latinos as this one large monolithic block. And in fact, they are not that. And in fact, an awful lot of Latinos, to the extent that stunned me, because I am still actively learning about this, they do not self-identify as brown, as Latino. They think of themselves as Anglo. They've been here 100 years. Who cares that their great-great-grandfather came from Mexico like yours came from Sicily, So, I mean, I think it's, for some reason, for a lot of reasons, given, the civil rights dramas of the 50s and 60s, America has been a lot more focused on the tortured history of African Americans, and the tortured history of Mexican Americans and Hispanic Americans has really just not been a thing outside of the areas where Jude and I have done so much of our reporting.
And I think, and Arizona is such an interesting political contrast to Texas, because on a certain level, there are some parallels. But I think Arizona, if you look at the numbers for the split of the, and recognizing the problematic nature the Latino vote, given that it's not a monolith. But the split in Arizona, from what I saw of the numbers when they came out, was that you did have a much higher proportion of Arizona Latinos voting Democrat or for Biden than in Texas. And one explanation for that is perhaps sort of the history we chronicle in this book, where there was an active movement to convince people who were American citizens of Latino descent, and most of Arizona's Latino population is of Mexican descent, that the assault on undocumented people was an assault on the larger community. And there were some US citizens of Mexican descent who felt that immediately and joined the cause to say, this will, any kind of, if you're going to crack down on immigrants, it's going to cause suspicion on anyone who looks like immigrants, and that means all of us. And so we're all in this together to fight it. And then there were others who in the community who didn't necessarily see what this had to do with them. What we heard from the people we interviewed is that over time, more people of Mexican descent who were American citizens started to realize that to join the fight or to understand the fight or to see have a stake in it as well as time went on, and sort of the relentlessness of these policies persisted. And so I don't know if that might have something to do with how things shook out, and the reaction to Trump, for example, being different here than in the Rio Grande Valley. So, but these are all fascinating conversations to continue, because it's really going to get to the heart of how do we understand what demographic shifts mean for electoral politics, for sure.
I think you just answered this, but Michael Bosworth asks, did all this activism in Arizona translate into a factor in the 2020 elections?
In Arizona, absolutely. And that's what I was trying to show in the last slide was you had many of young people whose youth was characterized by fearing that their parents would be deported when they went to work that day, or that they would run into a sweep on their way home, and that a loved one would be deported, or maybe a loved one was deported, that these events shaped their childhood. And many of those young people went on to become activists to try to change the political landscape of Arizona. So we have this very young, very dynamic group of people who are very savvy because they started when they were teenagers and now they're in their 20s and 30s, who are at the forefront of grassroots campaigns. And it's not just, and some of them are involved in things like police reform and other issues in the Arizona area. It's not strictly immigration anymore. But we have this politically activated group of young people who really mastered how to get out the vote in 2016, and that has extended into 2020. What remains to be seen, though, is that, I don't think that the Democratic Party can count on these voters being loyal unless these voters see that their efforts are paying off. And I'm not sure that at this point that they have seen the kinds of policies that they were hoping for. I mean, a great example is some of the activists that I'm describing helped elect Kyrsten Sinema to the Senate and are very disappointed. You might have seen the hubbub over the video that was filmed of Kyrsten Sinema in the bathroom. Some of that activist group, Lucha, that put out that video was very central to the fight against Arpaio and very central to getting Biden elected in 2020. So some of these young people are now questioning and saying, wait, we are helping to shape these elections for Democrats, but what are we getting in return? So I think, and obviously she's a unique case there, so what happens in the future is anyone's guess, because I think given that we have this stalemate persisting, what will come of it?
Well, dial down the political heat here for a minute and just ask you a little bit about your collaborations. Bryan, you spoke about how yours came about, but I'm just kind of curious, back of the house question, how it worked out working with a collaborator, in your case, Jude, and two collaborators, in your case, Bryan.
It was hard. It was hard. the research was not that difficult. The book pretty evenly split into thirds, and we could largely do that independently until about 2/3 of the way in, when we realized areas that needed to be jumped on. The writing, we all took a stab of. I ended up doing the lion's share of it for the simple fact that both Chris and Jason have full-time jobs, and this is all I do. This pays the bills. How about you, Jude?
Yeah, I mean, I came from public radio and had sat in court for a lot of the racial profiling case against Arpaio, and what became a contempt of court case that still goes on to this day to his predecessor, and the racial profiling case, not the contempt case. And Terry had written a book previously and had worked in magazines. So it was really a blending where sort of I brought a little bit more of some of the substantive legal part of it, and Terry brought all the know-how for long form writing, how to make things scenic, and how to really bring characters, the central figures of the book, to life and put it through their eyes. And of course, the fact that she's an Arizona native who's spent or close to an Arizona native who spent most of her life here. So we were able to really blend our specialties to bring those together. But collaboration is hard. Even the simple fact of where do the files live, is something that has to be thought through. And we had to build an elaborate system so that we could both access things. And, it just, the technical aspect of collaboration is something that has to be worked out as well.
I tell you where it's really great is in publicity. We have three guys. We don't say no to anything. We have events where we've had we have a big outdoor event in Austin next Friday, where all three of us will appear. We had an uproarious 3-person event at the San Antonio courthouse. And then we've done 2s and 1s, and we got time for everybody.
Bryan, for those who didn't see the John Wayne movie or Davy Crockett, King of the Wild Frontier, let's get in one quick debunking story. How about the line in the sand bit?
Well, the most famous Texas myth is the one most easily disproven, and that is the line in the sand. The story goes that the commander of the Alamo, William Barrett Travis, at the darkest moments, drew that line in the Alamo sand and said of his men, "Those who will defend freedom and fight with me, step across this line," and all did. And we now know, and people have known for a long time, that this was essentially conjured out of whole cloth by a hobbyist in the late 1880s. It was but almost immediately, within 10 years, it was in the dominant Texas history school books, and remained there till about 1913. But even then, at a time everybody pretty much knew it was a bunch of hooey, it lived on in legend as a type of thing that is still told. Most Texans don't have any idea of the origins of this, so they just think it's all fact. You go to the Alamo itself, and 10 feet in front of the front door, look down, and there's a gold bar that they've set into the concrete in tribute to the legend of the famous line in the sand. So that tension between fact and legend, is something that the Alamo lives with very much to this day.
Okay, I think we've proven that facts still do matter, right?
We hope.
I hope so.
We hope. Listen, I want to thank you both very much, both for your work and for attending today. I want to thank all the listeners and viewers out there, and many, many thanks to our sponsors of the festival. As we leave, there'll be a flash screen that will give you a direct link to ordering Jude's and Bryan's books, as well as a link to donate to the festival, which we would certainly appreciate as we look forward to next year's 21st gathering, which we all hope will be up close and in person. Thanks again, both of you, very much.
Thank y'all.
Thank you.